Hey y'all, it's me Tiffany and welcome back to my channel. So I decided I hated myself and do 31 books in 31 days for the whole month of August. So I'm dividing these videos up because I do want to talk about each book, and this is just easier, and I decided a vlog would be way too much effort. So I'm going to also be straight up honest before I talk about these. I am going to include graphic novels, mangas, whatever I decide to read in this for the challenge, because this is just my own personal challenge or whatever. But there's not going to be any short stories or anything like individual issues for comics. I don't think most people would expect that because it says 31 books in 31 days. But I just want to put that out there. So let's get to it. Okay, so the first book that I've read for this challenge is this cute little middle grade called More to the Story. I have mentioned this in my 21 books I want to read in 2021. I read Little Women so I could read this because this is a retelling, and I just wanted to get the full effect of it because, you know, I hadn't read Little Women. So this is about a close-knit American-Pakistani family in Georgia, and you know, it's nice to see something like this. Like, we need more representation, especially with like Muslims and other religious groups that are outside of just like Christianity, at least in the United States. And it's really wholesome. Their sibling dynamics is so cute, and it explores topics, you know, of course, of like family, religion, race, microtransgressions, childhood ambitions, and illness. The illness, you know, Little Women. If you haven't heard of like what happens at the end of Little Women, this is a retelling. That has to be in there, right? So I was over the moon that these characters actually feel like they're in middle school. They feel like real middle schoolers. It's written for like middle schoolers, and it doesn't feel like an older person's trying to pretend to be younger or is like out of touch with like maybe the mindsets of middle schoolers, you know. And that was like so refreshing because I have read middle grade books or even YA books that you could definitely tell like they're written by an older person who thinks that they need to dumb down even more to fit the age, or they make them a little too immature. So this was definitely like nice in that area. It captures like all the coziness of the original classic, and it, you know, this definitely, like, if you didn't tell me this was a retelling of Little Women, I think I would have picked up on it. It's not a step-by-step retelling, but it definitely captures the feel and like the sibling love, right? And basically, like, the story takes place where like their British cousin moves to their school, and Jamelia, I think that was her name, she wants to start a newspaper, and she wants to be a journalist, which in the main story we had a writer, and you know, journalist is kind of modern. And she kind of gets in trouble because she does want to write about like microtransgressions and stuff, but she uses somebody's story without their permission, which is something you don't do. Like, you can still write whatever you want to write, but if you're going to use somebody's experiences, you got to get permission, right? And then like the family's father goes away for 6 months for work, and the youngest one does get cancer, and they use social media to basically update and inform like the people who love this little girl about what's going on and raise money for research. And I like the way they handled it so much, and I appreciate it. 7 Half-Blood shall answer the call. To storm or fire the world must fall, an oath to keep with the final breath, in foes' arms to the doors of death. That means the second book I read was Son of Neptune. I've been meaning to get to this for a while. I'm doing like this series through Libby from my library, and these books are very popular. I wanted to start Mark of Athena instantly, but I had like 6 more weeks at the time I finished this. So yeah, this one's definitely a lot thicker than More to the Story, but I enjoyed this so much. And I did not like The Lost Hero really at all, to be quite frank with you. And this one was so much better. It's not a perfect book, but it definitely made me happy because I wanted to finish the series. Percy is back, and I love the original Percy Jackson series so much. So the fact that this was so much better made me happy. I did not want to give up on this. But if this one was trash, I wouldn't have kept continuing. So basically, Percy has amnesia and he ends up in the Roman camp, and he's adopted by Hazel and Frank. Hazel is the daughter of Pluto, and it's interesting because, Greek and Roman gods are basically like the same thing with different names, right? Like Poseidon and Neptune are supposed to be the same god, but the way this book describes it is, yes, they're kind of the same, but they're different at the same time, and they do have conflict within each other. And honestly, it took me a while to kind of get used to it. I am familiar like which gods are supposed to be which, but it just, depending on how close or how much time they spent with like the Greek god, depends on how close their personality is, and it did kind of confuse me a little bit, but I kind of got the gist of it. And I'm wondering if it wouldn't have confused me as fast if I wasn't doing this challenge and reading this quickly. Don't get me wrong, this book is good. I would have read it quickly, but with this challenge, and this book is over 500 pages long, I was probably reading this quicker than I normally would have. So I'm not sure if that is a fault with the book or maybe just the way I've read it. But they decide to go to Alaska and for their quest, and to be honest, I've never read Looking for Alaska, but it kind of gave me like that feel. I've heard other people talk about it, and I'm wondering if that's like a little jibe at that John Green book or not, but I don't actually know. So there were parts that were kind of slow, like the first, maybe fourth of the book for me was pretty slow, but then it picks up, and then there's a couple of parts where it kind of, slows down a little bit, but it wasn't as slow as the first part of the book. But once it started, it picked up outside of those couple of slow parts. Though I will be honest, I don't really like the amnesia trope. Like, that's Percy can't remember anything. And in most stuff, I think that's kind of corny, cheesy. I'm not a big fan of it. I've only seen it a couple of times that I've liked it really well. And I know his memories start like coming back throughout the book. But, that's still not I don't really care for that trope too much. And I kind of wish like they would have done something different for why he was in that Roman camp. But plot convenience, right? I really preferred his companions in the original series more than in this. And that might be a bias because, I had spent 5 books with Annabeth and Grover, right? Instead of Hazel and Frank. And there's nothing wrong with Hazel and Frank, but I spent 5 books with them. I'm just getting to know them now. And it's kind of weird to see Percy with new people, It's kind of like on an abstract thing, like with Pokemon, like the animated series, like there's nothing wrong with May, but when Misty left, it felt weird to have May there, right? And I know he changed his companions throughout the show, but I stopped watching after Hoenn. But that's like the only thing I can really compare of like, there's nothing wrong with Hazel and Frank, and I like them. It's just Annabeth and Grover, That's who I want to see with Percy. I will say that the quest in this isn't as well paced as it was in the original Percy Jackson, which these books are bigger. But there were so many flashbacks, and I understood why there's flashbacks. We got to learn these new characters and whatever, right? But I kind of wish that was handled slightly differently. Like I said, this isn't a perfect book, but it was so much better than The Lost Hero. I'm ready for Mark of Athena. I need more, and I'm almost tempted just to, go ahead and just use my Audible credits. I didn't listen to this whole thing on audiobook because of this challenge, and I will say that during the beginning, I did read it versus the audiobook, and then I restarted the beginning on audiobook. And during that first part, the audiobook might help you. Like I said, the first part is very, very slow. But when I was going back and forth through the day, whether I was cleaning or driving around, and I hopped back and forth between reading the physical book and the audiobook is well done. Outside of the beginning, like the book has like a nice size font. It doesn't, you don't, like it's an enjoyable read that you don't need an audiobook to push through, because there are definitely books that do better in audio. But yeah, I like this a lot, and it was so much better than Lost Hero. I know I said that a million times. Okay, so I'm formatting my third through fifth book differently. Technically, I read these as the volumes, but on Goodreads, they do have a, like the way comics are, they'll have like, issues, volumes, and if there's more than like one or two volumes, they'll condense them. So like volumes 1 and 2 are in a book right now, and volumes 3 and 4, like that bigger, like not omnibus, but kind of like that deluxe whatever, is about to be published. So I went ahead, and because these are rather short, like these are like only like 100 something pages in their comics, I went ahead and, even though I read these individually because it's what my library had, I counted the first two as one and the second and third as one, so that counts as 2 books. And I went ahead and finished the series, and I bought the individual issues on Amazon, but you can go ahead and pre-order the trade for the last volume, so I'm counting that as a book, but it's all the issues that are in that one, so it's not like an individual issue. I just wanted to make that clear, and I wanted to explain like why it's counted as 3 books instead of 5. If they would have had the entire thing as 1 book, I would have done that. But that's not even available for pre-order, so I'm pretending that, it's going to exist one day, but it doesn't help me now. So, after that long explaining and introduction, I read the entire line for, like, the Captain America, the Ta-Nehisi Coates. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. He is, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I know he did the Black Panther run. I have not read his Black Panther run, but I read this because there was I follow a lot of comic YouTubers and on Reddit and stuff, and I'm not the biggest comic book reader, but I do read them, right? And I just don't have the time or money to keep up with every single big hero in DC and Marvel. But I used to be a big Captain America fan, like when I was in high school. And I haven't read anything, I don't think, since like maybe 2011. But this was getting a lot of hate. And I wanted to see if it was justified. I know Ta-Nehisi Coates has a lot of anti-racism books and stuff. I've seen his name before, and I've seen like his book on the shelf. I just haven't personally gotten around to read it. I have thought about it though. And yeah, so I have feelings. At first, the first 2 volumes, they weren't bad. Captain America gets framed for murder, and this is like he's tying up, the run before this, and he gets arrested. The president gives him a pardon, and then he teams up with like the Ladies of Liberty and does Captain America things, right? And the first 2 volumes were fine. Like, I was like, okay, this isn't bad. People are kind of overreacting. And then it just progressively got worse. And I'm like, well, the 3rd is okay. The 4th is like, But at that point, like, the last volume is only 5 issues. And I could get it on Amazon really cheap. And I'm like, I just got to finish this through. There's only 1 volume left. And the last couple of issues is what people had the biggest gripe about. I understand why. A lot of times I feel like people overdo like criticism, and whether it's in either way, like sometimes things might, in either direction, but Like, I am interested in his other works to see how he does, because I know, like, he started off writing, like, essays or whatever, and I am planning on picking this up, and I know sometimes maybe it doesn't transition well. I heard his Black Panther run was worse than Captain America, and he made major improvements. So I'm willing to give him another chance after Captain America. I have interest in some Black Panther comics, but not his in particular. But yeah, so the plot, it just kind of like like it didn't flow well, and I'm trying not to give too much away because there's a lot of criticism on the internet, and some of them, they criticize things I wouldn't criticize, like his jadedness to how current American culture is. It totally makes sense. He's from a different time. Things are confusing. Our politicians are corrupt, and like, I get that. The jadedness towards America. Even though he is Captain America, he wants to hold American values, whether the government holds it or not, whether society wants to kind of sway either way, or if there's groups in like society. And that I'm totally fine with, right? I am totally fine with that part. I just wish he would convey the message better, and like the writing and the plot just seemed to be kind of like he was staggering to know where he wanted to go with this. And I know Marvel is kind of a weird company to work for, and they can't keep artists, and talking about artists, the art changed too often and it just kept getting worse. And I know that's a common thing with Marvel Comics, unfortunately. But yeah, I don't really recommend this unless you can get it from a library or rather cheaply. I've read a lot of better Captain America comics, and in theory, the ideas are great. The premises and the messages trying to convey are good. I just don't like the execution of how this was presented. Like, yeah, having a Captain America on the run, him being jaded, having these badass women he fights with, all that sounds cool, but it's just like the execution was so poor. And I know the art's not everything, but there was literally some art, especially towards the end, where Captain America's face just looks smush, and it takes you out of it, to be honest. Like, I feel like if you're going to kind of like keep like one run with the same writer or the same plot, the artist should stay like consistent, or you pick the most the artist that can mimic that dude's style the most. But I know Marvel doesn't treat their writers or their artists that well for the most part, so I don't blame them. But it wasn't necessarily that the art was horrible, but it just staggered so much. But the art for the last volume, especially like the last two, that's a no for me. That's a no for me. No, that's a no for me. Like, This was a fail for me. Like I said earlier, I would love to see like maybe him improve and retake on these ideas in the future, or somebody else execute these, but this was not it. Okay, so there's another book I did not like, and this one is popular. It's definitely like, a recommendation you'll see a lot on BookTube and Book Twitter. After I read this, I went on Goodreads and I found some other people who are also in the LGBTIA plus community that had some of the same issues, so that made me feel a little better. But earlier this year, I did like kind of like a pride tag for books, and it showed me some areas that I was weaker in representation. Like, I definitely read more lesbian stuff than I have read like in anywhere else, right? And one area I lacked in was asexual representation, and I want to fix, I want to read more like representations in other groups, right? So let's talk about love. I love the idea of this. I don't think, I don't want to say I don't think it was executed well, but that's my opinion. Like, it was kind of like a third person, but randomly first person for her thoughts. And the writing, it just, maybe this would have done better on an audiobook, I don't know. But reading this manually, it's just kind of jarring, kind of go back and forth. And she uses a lot of parentheses. And I know that's just a preference thing, but this is just my honest opinion. I didn't care for this much. I did not like Alice, and I hate to say that, but I don't like her. You know, this book falls into a trope of lack of communication, but I don't want to say like it's in a trope way, because when you're coming out with sexual or gender identity, you can't always just tell everybody instantly, right? Especially if you haven't came out yet. And nobody wants to force anybody to come out. But I know she tried to communicate with her girlfriend in the beginning of the book about how she doesn't care about sex. But the way both sides handled it, which is a very hard conversation, don't get me wrong, I know it's hard. And it's a very realistic conversation. I just wish they went into more detail about what asexuality is instead of just being like, I just don't care about sex. I'm just doing it because you like it. But you don't ever want to have sex with me. Like, yeah, but I'm just doing it for you. But I don't care. I don't get why you care. And everybody has different love languages. And but if you haven't came out or you don't really, it's hard for you to navigate in a way that would make sense to your partner. And if your partner doesn't know what something is, you may say harmful things, which in the beginning of the book, that was. And I don't mind the realisticness of it, but her friends are awful. The way she kind of talks about, like, I forgot his name, but the love interest that she ends up having, talking about, like, how she just randomly, okay, this is going to have some sexual terms. This is an adult book. This talks about masturbations. This talks about bodily functions, which I do love the fact that she talks about masturbation, and I love the fact she goes to therapy. I love those things, right? But how she just kind of saw her love interest and just got wet. Not everybody who's asexual is sexually repulsed, but the way it's handled it, and I know she goes to therapy and she talks to friends trying to figure out what happened because she's never had that before. And I know, like, not everybody's, like, kind of like on a scale, you can be on there too. But it almost had like that thing that I don't like that a lot of people say about gay people in particular, like, oh, you just haven't found the right one. I felt like it gave that vibe. Like, maybe if it was written differently or handled differently, I would feel differently about that scene. But that's the kind of vibe I got from this. And I did not like that. And I didn't like, how her friend, like, Feeny, I think that's her name. She's a bad friend. She's just like, you just need to sleep with him and see what happens. Maybe, like, as a cure-all for everything. And, maybe she would enjoy having sex. I know you can enjoy that as an asexual person and not feel the desire to initiate it, or you might be sex repulsed. But she's talking about how she doesn't want to have sex again, ever. So, like, and her friend was just kind of like, I'll help you find ways just to get you to sleep with him and things like that. And I didn't really like that. And, the party scene where they just abandon her and she goes out with her love interest and they get so mad at her for, like, the rest of the book. I'm just like, why are you friends with these people? And I know that she's closer to the guy because, like, she's friends with a couple, right? And she's roommates with them. And I know she's closer with the guy than she is the girl. But, like, I don't like their friendship dynamic at all. And the love interest is portrayed to be way too perfect. Like, he doesn't seem realistic, to be honest. And, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a good guy. But he's just like this shiny figure that magically just is like, I don't know how to explain this. Because, like, it's not a black and white subject. Everything is kind of gray, right? And then there's a lot of complexities in sexuality. So it's hard for me to critique it, right? But I just don't like how it was executed. So because of that, I made sure to find another asexual representation book that I read basically after this. Not because like I want to hit that box, but I want to find these good representations that, you know, I could recommend and I actually enjoy. I don't want to recommend things I don't actually enjoy, or I think, hey, this might be slightly problematic, you know. And I know there's almost no book in the world that doesn't have something problematic in it, but I don't know if this would be the thing I'd recommend. But every sexuality, like including asexuals, they all have their own experience. Like whether you're bisexual, asexual, like, you know, whichever, your experiences are not going to be the same as everybody else's, because people are on a scale, at least in those sexualities. And yeah, I wanted to find something different that I truly enjoyed. This definitely disappointed me. Do I think this is the worst book in the world? No. Like I said, the fact that she went to therapy and the fact that it normalizes like masturbation in these talks, and the fact that it actually talks about her getting wet, I want to see that more in books without them being eroticas. Alright, so you know how I mentioned just a second ago that I wanted to read stuff with asexual representation, and I wanted something that wasn't this. So I did some research, and I tried to find something that the asexual community finds as positive representation, but also a book that I would like. So the next two books I actually kind of had on my radar, and one of them I didn't know had asexual representation in it. The other one I did. So the one I read first as an audiobook is Full Disclosure, and it's about Simone Garcia Hampton. And she is bisexual, but one of her best friends is an asexual lesbian. And she does have another friend named Claudia. And, sorry, Claudia is the lesbian. Lydia is the other friend. And she's also bisexual. And they talk about, like, with each other about being invalidated, relationships, how they navigate through things. And what makes this book special is Simone is HIV positive, and she was born with HIV. I have not read a book with an HIV protagonist or even like an important side character. If it's ever been mentioned in a book, it's either been like in nonfiction books, like what I've read about like gay history, and especially like in the 80s with the AIDS, like with all the fear of AIDS and all that. So it was nice to actually see that, especially like in a high school setting, and she goes to group therapy. I don't know how the treatments and stuff with HIV go, but after I read this, I did a little research, and, you know, the person who wrote this book, I don't know if she's HIV positive, but she definitely did research if she is not. She keeps her diagnosis under wraps, which is understandable. She got bullied at her last school. Like, parents were freaking out. It's like, I don't want this girl near my daughter, which you cannot catch HIV just by, like, touching somebody, or you both touch a door handle. Like, it has to be through bodily fluids. Like, if both people cut hands and go like this, or through unsafe sex. And Simone is undetectable, which apparently, if you're undetectable, the chances of you passing HIV are extremely low. Like, it's almost impossible. Not impossible, but almost impossible if you're having, like, unprotected sex. One thing I love about this book, too, which I did love about Let's Talk About Love, is it talks about masturbation, and, you know, the girls, like, go look for a vibrator, and it's very sex positive, and I like that so much. I do. So Simone gets bullied because she likes this dude, and somebody else likes this guy as well. Found out about her HIV status, and decides if she don't leave this person's crush alone, they're going to out her. And then she's worried about it. She talks to her friends, and I think her friends had the right idea about maybe you should talk to an adult about this. instead of trying handling it on her own. But she's scared that she'd have to move schools again, or what would happen, because you don't want to snitch, you don't want to bring your parents involved, right? And eventually a tweet comes out, it outs her, and they find out who did it and the repercussions behind all that. And it has a lot of important conversations and about, because you got to disclose things. Even if you are undetectable, you do need to disclose with your partner. And I like the conversations about it. I like the doctor visits, and she has like two very loving fathers that adopted her, and they lost a lot of people to HIV back in the 80s during that hysteria. And, they admitted that they were nervous adopting her, but they knew how HIV worked, and they loved her anyways. They adopted her, and it was nice, and she does get some phobic remarks thrown at her, like, oh, she has to be a whore or this or that, and she was born with it. She had no choice. Like, nothing she did was wrong, and I love this a lot. And when talking about like the ace representation, I like the fact that like her lesbian friend Claudia talks about that she does try to have sex with her girlfriend because her girlfriend is sexual, and she's not really repulsed by sex. She just doesn't want it, and she doesn't get the feelings of it. And like I said, it's a spectrum, and I like that there are deep conversations about it, because this is a friend group and your friends would talk about these things. So the way all this is talked about, especially with the bisexuality, like our main character has had a girlfriend but only one, but people act like she's not actually bisexual because they just see her celebrity crushes and stuff like that. And that's a real thing that does happen with bisexuals and pansexuals. It happens with most sexualities, to be honest, where you're invalidated, at least at first. And especially if you don't do things the way people think you should, like, oh, you should have a boyfriend and a girlfriend at the same time at all times. Like, that's not how a lot of bisexuals or pansexuals work. Some do, but a lot don't. And so I'm glad, like, those conversations were to be had in a very YA setting. And so I appreciated this so much. This was such a good read, and I recommend this book to anybody. The next one is Loveless by Alice Osman. Georgia, who's our main character, is aromantic and asexual, and relationship orientation and sexual orientation don't always have to align, but they do here. She goes to college, and well, she's in London, so they call it uni, but here in the States, I think college. But she goes to uni, and she's never been kissed, and she navigates, like, she loves romances like rom-coms, and she's all for that stuff in like her media, and she loves fan fiction. But in real life, she's just like, no, she wants that. She wants the feelings of that, and she hasn't came to the terms that she is asexual and aromantic in the beginning of the book. She does towards the end. But this is like a coming out story, and it's interesting to see like how her mind shifts, and like, yes, I do want this, but no, I don't. And she's very true to herself. She does try to make attempts at things, but she still knows who she is, and I appreciate that. And it's interesting to see a mindset, and this is why I love coming out stories, is you can see people navigating, trying to figure out who they are, especially when like asexuality and aromantic is not represented hardly at all, especially the aromantic, because a lot of asexuals still want romance. It's showing that you can enjoy stuff in media and things and something not be for you. And I think that is very valid. It is very valid. And I like the way this book navigates it. This book also talks about masturbation. So I've had 3 books in a row mention like masturbation, and especially female masturbation. Like, society likes to make jokes about like dudes jerking off and stuff, but with girls it kind of seems like and things have definitely shifted over the past few years, or at least in the circle I'm in, nobody thinks much about it, right? And I like that in books that are meant for young people, to not be ashamed, not to be wrong with exploring one's body, because, you know, you got to learn yourself, right? Which, if you don't want that, that's fine too. But there's nothing wrong if that's what you're into. Georgia is definitely like sex repulsed, and I think that's like interesting than in the other two books, which I would say that like Alice kinda is, but Georgia is definitely more on that side. And it's interesting to see somebody who's, you know, like, because a lot of us aren't that way. And so it's interesting her having these monologues in her head about, you know, is something wrong with her? No, nothing's wrong with her, and how she wants to go through that, right? And she doesn't mind like reading about it. She just doesn't want it. And I mentioned earlier, like, it's interesting to see that, and I know a lot more people has to have those experiences, and it's good to finally see this in a book. There was one thing I didn't like, and her best friend Rumi is pansexual, which I haven't read a lot of books that mention pansexual. Some that have mentioned bisexuality, but not pansexuality, right? And she does use sex, the roommate, as a coping mechanism, which people honestly do that, but I don't like the fact that this was tagged onto a pansexual person, which it probably wouldn't bother me if we had more healthy pansexual representation, but pansexuals and bisexuals often get portrayed as like sexual deviants, or they don't know what they want, or they're just doing this or just doing that, and it kind of feeds into that stereotype, and I did not like that. And like, I have an issue that it doesn't really explain what pansexuality is mentioned, but it doesn't fully explain what pansexuality is, or even bisexuality. And I know those things are different. But if you don't explain these things, and then you have like, you put these stereotypes that people perceive with these things on top of that, but you don't explain this is not everybody experiences, it just kind of feeds into that more. So that is the gripe I do have about this book, but I enjoyed the rest of it. And like I said, no book is perfect, and since, you know, all of these sexualities are represented so little, I want there to be a lot more positive and, you know, a lot more positive representation. And I think the pansexuality representation in this is as I mentioned, but the rest of the book was good, and I definitely enjoyed it. I want to check out other Alice Oseman's books. I actually checked out Heartstoppers, so I am ready to check that. You know, like, I'm ready to get into that. I'm excited for it. Okay, so the next book I have read is IraqiGirl, Diary of a Teen Girl in Iraq. I actually checked out 2 Iraqi journals that were in books, and I read this one first. This one's different. This one, it's basically a printout of her blog, and her blog was between 2004 and 2018. This only covers 2004 through 2007. At the end, there are mentions of what happens in like 2008, 2009. But her blog is still up. I checked. I haven't read what's past this, but I don't know if I can truly critique this, because this is a 15-year-old girl writes a blog in a country where she's talking about politics and stuff in this way. It could get her in trouble, and everything's anonymous. And in the beginning, you know, it shows like her first blog post. I almost said blog post. And it goes in. You can definitely tell as she gets older, she's getting more mature. She's doing what she wants more. You know, in our first few tweets or first few blog posts, they're always kind of weird anyway, especially when we're young, right? Like, you know, I can't be the only one, or we can't be the only one who's had like kind of weird, you know, something like that when we were 15. And, you know, the format's interesting. Like, it's a printout. And she has her photos, which she don't have any like selfies in this because it's meant to be anonymous, but you know, she posted stuff like food and like her niece, like she has a baby photos of her niece and stuff, and She talks about how like she visits Syria and how much better Syria was doing than Iraq, and like the U.S. like occupation while we were in Iraq at this time, because this was when like the heavy deployments and stuff, when like Bush was in office, like it's during that time. And it's interesting to see the other perspective. I have definitely heard from soldiers, U.S. soldiers who've been there and stuff, but I haven't talked to anybody who's been in Iraq on that side, only from soldiers' point of views. And she's innocent in all this. She's just a girl going to what we would call high school. I'm not sure what they call it in Iraq, but it's interesting to see how she navigates through her feelings, and she knows people who's been killed. There's a lot of violence. There's flooding. Electricity's kind of going out. And, she weighs back and forth about her opinions on things, which we all do, especially when we're teenagers, right? And I do think that this is a good read. Some stuff's a little harder to read than others, especially when you hear about, like, the deaths that she knows of. But yeah, I would, and it even has stuff like just regular chats. Let me see. Yeah, here, is comments, like comment towards her and her response. So it's just a printout of her blog, and I am going to link her actual blog in the description below. That way, if you want to read it that way or read past this, if you do decide to read this, you have access to it. She hasn't updated it, I don't think, since 2018, but I hope she's doing well. I hope she's healthy, safe, and so is her family. Okay, so I got 2 more books I'm going to talk about, because 31 books in 31 days, I decide. The first video will have 11 and the other 2 will have 10. So these books I'm not going to go in as much detail of, because I do have a series. I don't know what the series is called, but I read like classics in the 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s. These next 2 books will be in the 1930s video that I will do, and I'll go into more detail about how I feel in those. But I still read them, and I'm going to basically have a gist of like what they are. So, As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner, which is a very beloved classic, and Nightwood. Nightwood is a classic in the LBGT QIA plus community, and it's like it's a lesbian book, and it's interesting. It is interesting for it. Both of these are interesting. Both of these were actually kind of more difficult reads than I expect. Not every classic is difficult, but there are some that definitely are. This one was definitely harder for me to understand and digest than this, just because of the way this is written. It's very poetic, it's very strange and flowy, and there's a lot of going back and forth, because our main character goes back and forth on her opinions. Like, she leaves her husband, then she gets with a girl, then she leaves that girl for another girl. Like, it's a lot. It is definitely interesting. This is definitely like the experience of reading this more than the plot, but I wanted to read like a classic queer book, and so this was highly recommended, and I picked this up. I'll talk about this more. And technically I read this first. I don't know why I talked about Nightwood first, maybe because I read it most recently. But As I Lay Dying, this is a difficult read, but this one is mostly because there are like 15 narrators, and dialect is heavy, and it's just kind of like, it's sad and it's goofy at the same time. Like, it's a bunch of hicks trying to do the right thing, getting in a lot of trouble, and the family dynamics and everything along with that. I'll talk about that more in the other video, but these 2 are gonna be in my 1930s video, and I'm excited to go into more details about these. Like, I love this so much, As I Lay Dying. This one, I'm just not sure how I feel, because it was, maybe I'm not smart enough to read this, but I really loved As I Lay Dying, and I'm definitely planning on getting into more queer classics, and this was definitely an interesting start. It's so unique, especially for it being in the 1930s. And yeah, so guys, that was the first 11 books I have read for this challenge. I got 20 more to go, and I do planning on making about 2 more videos so I can talk about these individually without them being too long. Have you ever done this challenge before, or even 7 books in 7 days? Let me know in the comment section below. If you've read any of these books and you enjoyed them, or if you hate them, let me know in the comment section below too. I would love to hear your thoughts on these, and I'll see you next time.